What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Bitcoin and Markets. My name is Ansel Linder. Today's going to be a little bit different show. We did live stream this morning for the CPI. You guys can go back and check that out. But today I wanted to react to a video that I saw a couple weeks ago, and I wanted to react to it live. I did do kind of an extended write-up, I think, on Telegram. This is one of Saifedean's recent videos where he is interviewing Arnaud Bertrand, this quote-unquote China expert. I have a lot of pretty strong views on China, so I thought I would go through that, and people have been asking me to go through it. So let's just bring up a few things here first before we get started. Bitcoinandmarkets.com. Check it out. I put out a new Bitcoin Minute. This is about all the 13F filings that we're seeing dropping right now. Of course, we'll probably see some trickle in at close of business right now here at the end of the day, because this is their deadline day. But you guys can sign up to get on the email list for free, or you can become a member, paid member, and get extra perks and extra posts. Like this premium post right down here, deflationary drift. This went out to the premium professional tier yesterday. Okay, now let's go in to this, and this should be coming through on Telegram. Let's see. A couple other people joined in, Raven and Boog, now on Telegram. So we will see who we get. Like I said, I'm not going to be streaming to Twitter for this. I'm a big Saifedean fan. I think he's done great things. Just his first book, The Bitcoin Standard, has done really great things for Bitcoin. He is an Austrian for the most part, but he is starting to struggle here. He's starting to have kind of a breakdown in public. I saw that he was either interviewed by or maybe had Constantine on his podcast. I don't know which one, from Trigonometry, and he was going crazy. So I thought, hey, I've been wanting to respond to this. Let me just go ahead and respond to Saif here, because this was a surprising episode. I don't know if I need to set it up any more than that. Arnaud is some French Chinese expert, so it looks like he's speaking 3 languages at least, and he sees things way differently than I do. But let's jump into it, and I'll make sure I have all of the levels set up. I also have this at 1.5 speed because they're both kind of slow talkers. But if that becomes a problem, let me know in the comments. I will be watching the comments. Okay, let's go.
So I wanted to just give you the chance to give me your opinion about life in China. And I guess perhaps a good place to start would be the issue that I just mentioned, the credit scoring system and the CBDCs.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I lived in China during close to 8 years. And I mean, maybe life for me is not extremely representative of the average Chinese, maybe even not at all. But my wife comes from an average Chinese family. I've traveled, all over China. I've been to all the provinces of China except for 3. I have many.
Okay, so he's been to all the Chinese provinces except for 3. That doesn't sound very average Chinese to me. The average Chinese person to me is a migrant worker, one of the bottom 80% in the country. There's only, I would say, maybe 100 million or 200 million kind of more affluent people that would be able to do that kind of travel. So right off the bat, he says he has an average Chinese experience. His wife had an average Chinese experience, but they've been all over China, visiting all over China, not just like for business or whatever, but to see what's going on all over China. So this is not an average experience right off the bat.
The local friends. I was living, in a residence where I was the only foreigner. So I think I have a fairly good understanding of life for the average Chinese. I mean, life is, those are people, just normal people with normal aspirations. Their daily worries are, how do I have a good job? How do I, get a good education for my children and so on. We have this tendency of, seeing the Chinese as this sort of, people under constant, control by the government and living in fear and so on. And that's absolutely not the case at all.
Have you guys heard of the white paper protests? So in China, they had to hold up white paper because they can't protest over there, and so he wants us to believe that China is this, egalitarian society and everyone's normal. Also, notice everyone's normal in China, but when they start talking about the United States now, they don't concentrate on the everyday person. Okay. If you want to compare and contrast what they're trying to compare and contrast, they're trying to compare and contrast the average Chinese to the nation state of the United States, when they should be comparing the average American to the average Chinese person, or America to Xi Jinping and the CCP. That's what they should be comparing, but they don't do this. They put it in a different category here. But what was I saying there? The white paper protests. They cannot protest in China. They are. And then guess what? They went ahead and let it happen for like a few days. They got all the people with all their CCTV cameras. They got all the people, the leaders and stuff, and they went in and disappeared them later. And so, no, yes, everyone's living in fear. If they weren't living in fear, why would they need to have a white paper protest?
In fact, they're just pretty similar to just any human being on Earth with the same dreams and same aspirations.
Same as every human being, except they're going to demonize Americans. So Americans aren't average, everyday human beings. The Chinese are average, everyday human beings, and Americans are evil.
When it comes to the social credit system, it's the narrative around that is crazy, because if you go to China and you ask any Chinese in the streets, what's your credit score, they will be extremely confused because there is no credit score. Like no one has ever heard about this, and it's a narrative that.
Well, this is relatively new. I think it started like in 2014 or 2015 that they really started rolling this out in earnest. I don't know when. I don't know if he still lives there, when he still lived in China, what his experience with that was. But this is relatively new. And then new standards came out in 2022 as well, that tried to maybe more codify it or formalize it. And they haven't been having very much success with it. If you want to, you can go check out the South China Morning Post. This is a state media outlet, English state media outlet. And it exists. I mean, China's social credit system is a set of databases and initiatives that monitor and assess the trustworthiness of individuals, companies, and government entities. A good rating could offer priority health care or deposit-free renting of public housing, not to mention other things, while a negative rating could see individuals banned from flights and trains, and not to mention other things like disappeared for holding a piece of paper. You could be disappeared for going and protesting your local bank. All sorts of things. And so, yes, this is definitely a thing. They know what it is. He might not have been there since this has been a big thing. And they've doubled down on it in 2022. So I don't know what his situation is, but it definitely exists.
It has been, extrapolated to such a point that there is almost no connection to reality anymore. So there is no score that rates people based on their everyday action. That's a complete myth that doesn't exist. The only thing that does exist is that
I just showed you it does exist. That is a government outlet. It does exist. He's lying.
There is a system of blacklist, whereas if you commit a crime, and you go to court, and a judge decides on a sentence, you have a right to a lawyer and so on. You can be put on a blacklist that forbids you certain things, like taking fast-speed train or the plane or stuff like that.
Notice, without due process of law. I mean, yes, there are things like this in the United States where you get on the no-fly list or something. Yes, but what he's trying to say is that China is uniquely better than the United States. And Saifedean is trying to figure this out. He leans into that idea that China is uniquely better than the United States when this is rampant penalization, guilty with no due process of law.
and it's for types of crimes that typically have to do with fraud. So I actually know two people who are on such a blacklist because they actually just defrauded people, borrowed money by faking documents with no intention of repaying it. That's the type of thing that might land you on this blacklist. And the thinking is that if you committed fraud, defrauded other people, you shouldn't be allowed to live a life of luxury by traveling around, taking the plane, staying in nice hotels until you've repaid the people you've wronged. That's
according to whom and with what redress? If you held a white piece of paper, maybe you're put on this no-fly list and no train list. It's vastly different situation.
Kind of the thinking. So that's what exists. on all these calls about
even trying to make it the rosiest picture they can, they have to admit that there is massive criminalization without due process of law.
All these stories around those calls that fluctuate based on I don't know, whatever you do on a daily basis, that's just not there. It's inexistent. It's a myth.
And what about political speech? How is that affected? Or can you get banned from getting on airplanes because you've been critical of the regime or the government or your local government or something like that?
I mean, I don't know of any cases. I haven't seen any cases of that. I've seen many cases of people criticizing the government. It's actually very common in China, especially among certain classes of people, like wealthy people. And
like the white paper protests. That's what he's talking about.
Maybe people in the academic sphere, like university teachers and so on, they tend to be a bit more liberal.
Or what about the umbrella protests or whatever that was called in Hong Kong, right? Critical of the government. What if you're critical of one China, two systems? What if you're critical of I don't want to call Taiwan like Chinese Taipei. I want to call it Taiwan. Nobody, you're going to prison.
So they heavily criticize the Chinese government often. It's a bit the inverse as in the West, funnily enough, where in the West it's more the elites who are quite pro-government, pro-system, and the people who are quite, distrustful of institutions and so on. In China is the complete opposite. Like the average, worker or farmer and so on, they will tend to be extremely patriotic, extremely pro-government. But the elites, not all of them, but a significant share, they're much more critical. And I haven't seen any case of. I've read some cases of that in the Western media. I don't have any. I haven't seen any personal cases of that. So I don't know how much of that is true. What is true?
What? Does he not know Elon Musk? Does he not know Donald Trump? Does he not know all of these billionaires that say bad things about the regime? Of course this happens. He needs to spend more time at home, apparently. But it is interesting that dichotomy is interesting where the elites are the ones speaking out. But of course, then you have situations like Jack Ma that just gets taken into custody for several months and re-educated and let back out again. You have no basic rights that the government cannot infringe if they want to infringe over there in China. And now I'm no China, like I've never lived in China. I've never visited China. So I'm just saying this from years and years of reading, years and years of staying up to date with other Chinese experts, and having a relative understanding of the economics. Like Saifedean should be able to look at this and be like, okay, these are communists. Do I believe what they're saying? I know how communists act. I know how Marxists act. China is a Marxist, Leninist system. And I have this piece that I put out. This is a free macro minute on the website, Xi Jinping Thought. So he is a straight up Marxist Leninist. Xi does not hide it. Quoting from Kevin Rood, Xi has brought that era of pragmatic, non-ideological governments to a crashing halt. And they're talking about Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And then Xi came in and he brought all of that to a halt. In its place, he has developed a new form of Marxist nationalism that now shapes the presentation and substance of Chinese politics, economy, and foreign policy. In doing so, Xi is not constructing theoretical castles in the air to rationalize decisions that the CCP has made for other, more practical reasons. Under Xi Jinping, ideology drives policy more often than the other way around. Xi has pushed politics to the Leninist left. This is Kevin Rudd. He's former Prime Minister of Australia. He's dealt with these people. He knows them intimately, and he's saying that they are Marxist, and Xi has pushed it to the Leninist left. Economics to the Marxist left, and foreign policy to the nationalist right. He has reasserted the influence and control the CCP exerts over all domains of public policy, private life, reinvigorated state-owned enterprises, and placed new restrictions on the private sector. Meanwhile, he has stoked nationalism by pursuing an increasingly assertive foreign policy, turbocharged by a Marxist-inspired belief that history is irreversibly on China's side, and that a world anchored in Chinese power would produce a more just international order. In short, Xi's rise has meant nothing less than the return of ideological man. So that is what we're talking about here. Saifedean should be able to sniff this out and be like, dude, they're communists, Marxists, Leninists. They're not good. They're going to lie about everything. Lies. Okay, back to the video.
True is that in private conversations, criticizing the government is extremely common. It's even routine. But you probably shouldn't go around and, try to start a protest movement against the system and, shout your opinion on social media and so on, because that's going to be a bit more.
Yeah, protesting, white paper protest, that's not allowed. You are not allowed free speech over there.
Or a bit more repressed, let's say. Even though you always need to distinguish in China.
Again, even his rosy, trying to put rose-colored glasses on it, he still can't get away from, you cannot protest, you cannot say anything bad on social media. So there you
go. Between criticisms of local governments and criticisms of specific actions, which is actually encouraged and not repressed at all, with criticisms of the system as a whole, where you say, we need to end the Chinese Communist Party or the Communist Party of China, or stuff like that, where that's not okay. So there are actually many channels through which you can criticize the government, and they often do survey, even online, where they post all the criticism of people. That's very common, but you shouldn't call for like an overthrow of the whole system. So it's quite nuanced, actually.
How about calling Xi Jinping Winnie the Pooh? How about that? What happens to you there? What happens if you say Xi Jinping is a dictator? Okay, I can say right now in America, Biden is a dictator. Biden is a Marxist, a cultural Marxist. Kamala Harris, a cultural Marxist, and nothing happens, right? But over there in China, if I say that Xi Jinping needs to step down, he's been doing bad things. We want to go back to Deng Xiaoping and get, not go down this Marxist-Leninist path. Get Winnie the Pooh out of there. I would not be able to say that in China. Something very simple like that. Very simple. I'm not calling for an overthrow. I'm just saying we need to go back and unwind these Xi Jinping reforms. They're horrible. They're breaking the country. And look at what they're doing. China's crashing. The Marxists are running it into the ground. Now, you say that over there in China? No, you can't.
Yeah, and I think, one of these things about following your account that has been really eye-opening for me is to just try and draw parallels with other countries. You can't really get away with saying, let's overthrow the American government in the US, all right?
That's not what he said. Criticizing the government is what he said, not overthrowing. So that's a straw man.
I think what the last year made much more clearer is maybe you could get away with that because the U.S. is a failed banana republic at this point, but you can't get away with saying, but let's overthrow the real U.S. government, which is the Israeli government. So we saw over the last few months what happens in the U.S. if you're critical of the Israeli government. We saw,
and he should take a break from making content. He cannot go 2 minutes without going down this rabbit hole. I'm not sure where Saif lives. I think there is some organization he has up in Canada. I think he spends time in the U.S. and Lebanon. He used to teach at the American University in Lebanon, but I don't know where he lives now. But he needs to take a break because this is making him have an irrational bias towards all of these subjects.
Peaceful demonstrators getting brutalized by the police. We saw people's lives ruined because of things they posted online. We saw the police coming after people because of things that they've said, and that's happened in France, in Germany, in all kinds of Israeli client states all over the world. And then
now, for my part, I try not to. It doesn't. I could get emotional, and if I think about it in a humanitarian sense, yes, there is emotions tied up there. There's a lot of shoulds and oughts even, but there's not like. That doesn't help you understand the situation. If you just let emotions take control, you're not going to think about it rationally. You're going to think about it emotionally, and just spiral in your bias. And I think that's one thing we saw with. I haven't watched the interview, whatever the back and forth between him and Constantine, other than just what was a little 1-minute clip on Twitter. But he seems like he is spiraling down this. He just needs to take a break. But everything always comes back to Israel for him, and the evil United States. Even though he's speaking English, he sold probably most of his books in the United States, and United States has most of the Bitcoin. United States has most of the thinkers, most of the universities. He taught at the American University there in Lebanon, and so like he's just demonizing America when. He doesn't see that it is his whole entire life, basically.
You think about what is what is this horrific thing that they're talking about in the case of China, and
oh, and sorry, I keep breaking in here, but Mises as well. Mises obviously was, was he Austrian or was he German? I don't know, but he was Jewish, and Saifedean is that's the father of the Austrian School of Economics. Hayek, I think, was also Jewish, another father of the Austrian school, and that's Saifedean's big economics, school of economics. And they came to America, right? They fled Europe that was against Israel, like he is here, and they fled to America. So I don't know why all the America bashing. I mean, I do know that America isn't perfect. America does bad things. But just like that, Arnaud was saying that China, they're just average Chinese trying to get by in their life. That's the same with Americans, okay? Average Americans trying to live their life.
Yeah, maybe there is some kind of political repression, just as I believe you'd see pretty much anywhere. No government is excited about letting its citizens get together and organize and brainstorm how to overthrow the regime.
Well, that's actually protected in the United States, unlike China.
But at least in China, they're concerned about their own regime, their own government. They're not out there trying to protect a foreign government, especially one that's conducting a genocide. Would you agree?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a rather unique characteristic.
Well, what's going on with Burma and stuff? You guys should look into that. Yeah, China does meddle in a lot of foreign country affairs.
Of China, it's probably the most independent country on earth in terms of sovereign independence, where they don't do any military alliances. They don't have any with anyone.
Public, but I'm sure they have private because they have been involved with Southeast Asian politics.
They're very independently minded in the way they go about things. So you're right. It's they care a lot about sovereignty and about protecting their own interest and their sovereignty in a way that very few other countries do.
Yeah, and I think this is really this is quite telling. I think the issue is not so much the repression, because a lot of U.S. allies are very repressive. The U.S. itself is very repressive. I mean,
just to touch on what Arnaud just said there, that they don't go around doing this. Well, that's because they can't. They couldn't. Remember, China was a extremely poor nation until 1980. And you could even go up to close to the year 2000. They were extremely poor country. They couldn't go out and meddle. And what do? In their brand new 20-year-old kind of powerful status that they have now, what are they doing? They're getting involved with all of these places. Absolutely. The 9-dash line in the South China Sea, what do you think that is? That's taking over sovereign territory from other countries. It's completely false.
We see when it comes to freedom of speech in the U.S., I mean, Texas is a place that prides itself on being a place of freedom, so on. And then the governor of Texas a few months ago was going on saying, we're going to arrest people and throw them in jail if they say mean things about Israel. And you start realizing, yep, people are not angry at China because they don't have freedom of speech. People are angry at China because it's increasingly independent of the U.S. and it increasingly does things that the U.S. does not really approve of.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, Noam Chomsky had a very good definition for what's called the so-called China threat. And the China threat is the fact that the US cannot threaten China. when you dig into it, it's what we were speaking about. It's China's independence, it's China's sovereignty, and the fact that as it rises, as it becomes more powerful, the US has less and less power, and less ability to impose its will on China. So that is really at heart the China threat. China doesn't go, in the US trying to manipulate its democratic process or stuff like that. Despite
whatever, dude, they have those Chinese the CCP outreach programs on many campuses. I was going to say most campuses. I don't know if that's the case, but they have them in many places. I forget the name of them though now. But no, they are obviously trying to get involved with the youth in the United States. And just to push back on that idea of the US not being able to interfere with China. Okay. I mean, these people try to say that the US is by, nature a interventionist power, but we're not. It wasn't until World War II that we became more interventionist, and that was because of the Cold War, where we were trying to, we're not perfect. Nobody's perfect, but we're trying to act as a bulwark against communism and Stalin, who killed 50 million of his own people. We're trying to act as that bulwark against that. And when you're going into these countries and there's Soviet operatives in that country trying to turn and trying to bolster the communist revolutions in these other countries, that's where this whole mentality comes from. I'm not saying we do the right thing all the time, but that is what the thought is behind that. But deep down, the U.S. is a non-interventionist country. Just go and you can Google American non-interventionism. Well, we are by definition or by nature a non-interventionist country. We don't want to do this. It's just that after World War II, we kind of got drugged down this path. And that's part of my thesis, is that is ending. That is ending. We're going back to a time of non-intervention. We're going back to a time of isolation, maybe Western Hemisphere, something like that. But in China's case, they don't have to really worry about the U.S. They have to worry about internal schisms, internal breakups. That's the history of China. China rarely sees a period of 50 to 100 years of this, a consistent government. So there's going to be big time shakeups in China. It's not going to come from abroad, though. It's going to come from domestically. And then that's why they might, one reason why they might get onto the Uyghurs here in a second, but that shows with Tibet, that shows with the Uyghurs, that shows with Taiwan and Hong Kong. It shows with the Shanghai clique. That's where actually the Shanghai clique is very powerful. Xi Jinping kind of came out of that clique, but he has since turned on them, from what I understand. So there's all sorts of these rivalries and breakaway areas in China. I mean, if you fast forward 50 years with the demographic problems and the economic problems and the return of Marxist-Leninism to China, like Mao 2.0, there's a good chance that China's borders will not look the way they do. And it's not because of anybody invading them. It's going to be because they break apart.
Some of the propaganda. Actually, if you look at opinion pollings in the US, opinions of China are terrible. Like it's like 90% negative opinion about China. I can't think of a single politician in the American system that is pro-China. So if he did some influence campaign, they're really, really, really incompetent. So, to me, that shows that
Tim Walz is a big China phobe or China, whatever, philic person. He really likes China. He's traveled there 30 times. He taught there back in 1989 during Tiananmen. Now he is the vice presidential candidate. He is a big China lover because he is a communist. He is a communist, Tim Walz. Play.
The cardinal principles of Chinese foreign policy, they don't interfere in other countries' internal affairs, and they stick to it. And the US is, of course, the exact opposite. They have entire government agencies whose sole purpose is to interfere in other countries' internal affairs, like the National Endowment for Democracy or agencies like that.
Yeah, and I think an enormous number of these NGOs that are out there to talk about human rights are just mechanisms of overthrowing foreign governments and imposing U.S. puppet regimes.
Exactly.
I think
but those NGOs that are trying to do that are mainly a result or an outgrowth of cultural Marxism and the rise of Marxism through Davos, through supranational governments like the EU, NATO, those supranational bodies where they have been taken over by Marxists. So once again, it's Marxism, and China. Now you're defending China. You need to think about the United States as at least having a constitution, and that we can at least fight. We at least have some form of due process. It's not perfect, and there's a lot of people that fall through the cracks, but it's not comparable to China at all.
This became very, very, very transparently clear over the last year. I mean, people are constantly freaking out about all kinds of real or imagined human rights abuses all over the world. And then when Israel is out there, the president of Israel saying there are no innocent people in Gaza, we want to kill them all. And the prime minister saying we must erase their seed. And the minister of defense is saying we will punish them. We will kill as many as we can. And we need to go we need to kill as many as we can. And then we have the finance minister saying we need to get the population down from 2.3 million to 0.1 million. You hear complete silence from all of these human rights organizations. Human Rights Foundation in particular is one of my favorite examples because it's been absolutely amazing about that. In Botswana or Lesotho, the king does some kind of little reform that isn't very popular among these NGOs, and they go crazy about it. But then the Israeli finance minister says we need to get the population of this place down by 95% through murder or expulsion. And it's just completely ignored.
Yeah.
And so
well, I don't want to really go down this, but the Palestinians should maybe go to Egypt. How about that idea?
It's all been, I mean, I've always been, of course, very skeptical about U.S. foreign policy. I am Palestinian. I've grown up and seen the hypocrisy there. But I've just sort of always assumed that, clearly China is worse because communism and all of those things. And then
clearly, come on, Saif. See why I say he needs to take a break? Because he's clouding his judgment of Marxism with what's going on in Israel. Okay, I hate that there's violence. I condemn all violence in the world, anywhere it's found. But instead of throwing straw men around and go from an emotional place, I know it's hard, but you're not going to make rational determinations from that lens, from an emotional lens. And right there, he hand waved communism away. I bet if you go back 5-10 years and you ask Saifedean Moose from 2014, and you ask him his thoughts on communism versus Western ideals, he would be really hard on communism. But now he just hand waves it like, oh, communism, that's what they say, blah, 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 but da, da, da. So, yeah, that's kind of the general idea of this.
Start comparing and you see, well, maybe that's not the case. And maybe all of this talk about Chinese imperialism and Chinese foreign policy really is completely out of place, because really think about it, all of these people complaining about Chinese influence in Africa. You don't hear a lot of Africans make the same complaints. It's quite astonishing, because it's so lacking in self-awareness that Americans are saying, we need to be in charge of Africa. We need to be continuing our imperialism in Africa. We need Africans to only borrow from our debt slavery institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and we need to be able to control their politics and remove their governments when we like, and we need to be able to enforce geopolitical alliances on these governments. And now China is threatening that, and the evil, devious Chinese are threatening it by just not interfering with those countries' politics. They go and they build a seaport, or they build a hospital, or they build infrastructure, and it's just purely it's a purely business transaction. It's so, and it's presented as if it is so evil, because
okay, this is where I have a lot to say, and I would consider myself at least somewhat of an expert on this. No, they're first off, it's a straw man saying that that's the U.S. or the West is saying, oh, only we can lend money. This is our imperial realm. You can't come into here. No, it's like, sorry, guys. Thinking that the governments that are there are like somehow good, and the U.S. is going to overthrow the government into a bad government, whatever. But you have to start from that they're actually a non-corrupt government to begin with, which is not the case. All governments are corrupt. And so what the Chinese are doing is they're coming in and they're giving loans to the corrupt people in charge. And they're using it on pet projects or to stuff to line their own pockets into uneconomic things that saddle the country with unpayable debt. Now, people will argue that the IMF does that as well. But the way I look at the IMF, and again, they're not perfect. They make a lot of mistakes, and there's good and bad people in every organization. But the IMF will say, hey, right now there's a lot of corruption in your government. We can't give you this loan unless you clear up some of this corruption. And so then they'll go and clear up the corruption and then get the loan. Or they say, hey, you need to do these reforms. Open up your markets, do this or that. And they will do that, but it doesn't fit culturally with those places. Those places have a cultural history. They have their own governments that they have tried to create and sustain on their own. And now you're coming in and saying you need to make these reforms. It's not natural, of course, and they're not going to stick. They're not going to be very good at doing those things. And so that it harms the country overall. But they don't have to take the loan. They don't have to take the loan from the IMF. The IMF, the same with your banker. Okay, if I go to get a loan from a banker, they're going to ask me all about these things, and they're going to see, like, let's say I have $100,000 in credit card loans or $200,000, whatever, and they're going, what's all this debt? No, we can't. We're not going to give you this loan because you don't have a job. You have $200,000 in credit card loans and $100,000 in school loans. We're not going to give you this. You need to work on these things, get a job, start paying down your debt, get your credit score up, right? Then we'll talk about getting you a loan. But that's natural for a banker to do or a lender to do. Now, if the IMF goes to a nation state and says, hey, you need to, start having taxes, having a progressive tax in your country. You need to get rid of corruption. You do this or that. And then we'll give you a 5-6% on your loan, because that's what that's what you deserve, right? That's demonized. And that ends up getting countries in big time trouble, because these countries are not the same way with a irresponsible borrower from a bank. These countries are going to be irresponsible with the money. And now taking it back to the Chinese situation. So China came in and they have these irresponsible borrowers, and they decided just to give them a bunch of money. What's happening today? Everybody's defaulting. Not everybody, but a huge majority of all of these projects are defaulting everywhere Belt and Road has been tried, because these projects, like a port in a city or a train track or whatever rail system, these infrastructure projects, they weren't built for a reason. Okay, if I am an investor, I'm going to invest where I can get a return on my investment. So instead of a centralized Chinese country dictating a policy to go out and invest $200 billion, find an infrastructure project in Africa that we can spend $40 billion on. Okay, that's how they direct it. Now in the West, ex-IMF, this is just normal businessmen from the West going to Africa. They're going to invest in places where they can make a return on their investment, but they saw that they couldn't make a return on their investment. So there's no trains there for a reason. There's no ports there for a reason. It's not because you're trying to keep them down. It's because there's no return on investment there. And so the BRI comes in and they think, oh, we're just going to centrally direct this to give loans out. And the other side of the contract is we seize the port, or we seize whatever property that we're building, whatever infrastructure that now becomes Chinese Communist Party property. And that's how they're going about this. Okay, so it's a completely different mindset. But there's not those things for a reason. Now there is a lot of charity. I mean, I bet if you went and looked at the Chinese per capita charitable contributions, they're near zero, if not zero. But if you go to the West, especially the United States, the most charitable country in the world per capita. So there is charities out there, but even the charities didn't build this stuff. Why? Because there's no return on investment. And that sucks to say, but that's just the case. And so, yeah, that's what I had to say about these infrastructure projects, about China, about the BRI, and all of that. Okay, let's continue.
They're not trying to tell Kenya or Tanzania how to live their life. They're not trying to impose all kinds of policies on them. They just take the government as it is and they sign a deal where.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty bad business practice. I'm not going to tell that guy to get a job. I'm just going to give him a loan. Do you think that's a good banker? No, it's ridiculous to say something like that. If you're a good businessman, if you're a good lender, a good capital allocator, which is what banks are, then you are going to demand certain things of your borrowers. And just going in there and giving these people blank checks, not asking any questions, you're asking for trouble and failure. And that's what China's getting right now from the BRI. That's why they've completely shut down the old process and they're trying to switch to a new process, because it's completely failed. And now it's strapped these countries with like Kenya and Sudan or whatever, that strapped these countries with massive amounts of debt that they cannot pay.
We have this company that's going to build this port. This is the cost. And that's presented as if it is imperialism, whereas the American response is just presented as if it is normal, which is pretty striking.
No, it's not imperialism from China. It's centrally planned Marxist stuff, communist stuff. That's what it is. It's just bad business. It's not imperialism. It's not imperialism from the West either, in my opinion. Like I said, there are some holdover times from the Cold War, holdover mentality, I guess, from the Cold War. But overall, it's not imperialism on either side.
Yeah.
the hypocrisy of it.
Yeah, what's sort of striking to me is that before China introduced the Belt and Road Initiative, the West had no infrastructure initiative in Africa and a lot of those poor countries in Latin America and so on. China arrives with this, which is a fairly good deal for African countries. It's basically saying, instead of paying you cash for resources, cash which often can be can lead to corruption and so on and so forth, we're going to build for you things that are actually useful for the population. So seaports or hospitals and so on and so forth. And by the way, there is this great quote by a former, I think, president of Kenya, if I'm not mistaken, which was, every time the Americans come, we get a lecture. Every time the Chinese come, we get a hospital. I think that illustrates things quite well. And only after China rolled out the Belt and Road, then you have the West, starting to speak about infrastructure, doing infrastructure themselves. So I think it illustrates quite well that behind the China bashing, they recognize that there is value in what China is providing, and they have to compete in case they want to stay relevant in those countries. So just in that, what China has been doing in Africa has been good for those countries, because at the end of the day,
no, it hasn't been good for the countries. It's over too. That whole model is over. They've switched to a new model of Belt and Road investment, and they're not doing that because it was such a disaster for everybody involved.
It's a good thing, even if the West then comes behind and tries also to compete by building.
Like, imagine, I mean, it's really hard to argue with this emotional point of every time, the quote that he said, every time the U.S. comes, we get a lecture. Every time China comes, we get a hospital. Okay, that's an emotion. That's kind of shutting down the conversation with a plea to the emotions. But no, what happens when you have that hospital? Okay. And you have to pay $200 million a year to pay off that loan that they gave you to build the hospital. And then you can't pay it. The hospital shuts down. And then you have this hospital sitting somewhere has no doctors, no patients, no nurses, because they had to shut down the hospital. And maybe some criminal elements move into that building, like we see in other places that Safe has been talking about recently. So no, building hospitals and building these infrastructure projects are not always good. They're typically bad, especially if they're done by a central planner, the CCP. Go spend $40 billion in Kenya and give them a loan for $40 billion, build their hospitals and build some rail that they can't afford. They can't afford to keep it up. And so what happens? Then there's unused infrastructure. And that's happening in China. I mean, you can see it in the Chinese model domestically, and now they're trying to export that same sort of model internationally, and it's not working. It's failing miserably.
Infrastructure that would not have happened if China hadn't done the Belt and Road. And on the debt thing, this so-called debt trap, this is actually this enrages me, because if you look at the debt structuring of those countries, most of the time China's debt burden is actually very low compared to Western institutions, and most often at a much smaller interest rates than, say, the IMF or pension funds in the US and so on and so forth.
Okay, that's a good point. I don't think that is the case. It's not minuscule, but it is somewhat minor. I think most of those countries owe a lot to the World Bank. That's like the biggest lender, and then IMF comes after that, and then China comes after that. But the argument about lower interest rates is a bad one, because they're obviously a risk. That means that they didn't assess the situation properly. They didn't assess the risk of this loan. And so, yeah, they have lower interest rates because they should have given higher interest rates. They were idiots. And another thing about China is they are very hardcore about rolling over debt. So when he talks about the debt trap, a lot of that comes from the inability to roll over Chinese debt. So the World Bank and the IMF, they'll work with the country. Yes, they'll create some requirements, some reforms perhaps in the country, and then they'll roll over that debt because they want to make sure their borrower can pay them. All right. China won't roll it over. They're very, very strict about that. So, and then what's in the contract? Oh, well, you need to turn over this infrastructure to us, or whatever the case is. So that's where the quote unquote rumors of the debt trap comes from, things of that nature. So overall, again, they're trying to build this as like some brilliant centrally planned thing, which obviously is not the case because central planning doesn't work. And that's the story of China's Belt and Road.
So yeah, that's another typical narrative that's done just for the purpose of bashing China, that has very little basis in reality.
Okay, and then what about Chinese foreign policy in the East Asia, South Asia region? What is your view of Chinese foreign policy's objectives there, and what do you think are the?
Let's see if he mentions the 9-line.
Problems that Westerners identify. Where do you think they're accurate, and where do you think they're inaccurate?
I mean, the big thing, from a Chinese standpoint, it doesn't fall under foreign policy because it's their own country. But obviously, the big topic is Taiwan, and there are also a lot of misinformation around that. Maybe I can tell the story so that people have a bit of background. So. Taiwan, what happened is basically an unfinished civil war. So at the end of World War II, Taiwan was occupied by Japan. It was part of China under the Qing dynasty. Then it was colonized by Japan in 1895.
Okay, before we talk about that, let's talk about this 9-line, which he will not say anything about because he's a liar. He's a Chinese propagandist. And here is the 9-line, this red line. This is unheard of in international politics. This is what they claim. Of course, then Vietnam has their claims, Philippines has their claims, and Brunei, Malaysia. But of course, screw all these countries. China needs it. That's pretty aggressive behavior. They're even coming over here. There's been altercations recently in the South China Sea. And what they'll do is they'll hire their, what do you call it? I guess private fishing boats. They'll kind of commandeer it, and they'll use these private fishing boats in aggressive maneuvers against the Filipinos, whatever. They're fishermen, and they've even started sending, I think, some Navy ships down here to patrol their claims, which is in violation of international norms. So there you go. They are aggressive for sure. But no, let's talk about Taiwan and how I can't even say Taiwan in China. I have to say Chinese Taipei.
It remained occupied by Japan until the end of World War II, where the Cairo Conference decided that it was going back to China. And at the time, it was the government of Chiang Kai-shek, the so-called Republic of China government, that was managing China. And then at the end, so Taiwan came back to China in 1945. And at the end of the Second World War, there was a civil war in China between Mao, so the communists, and Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, the KMT.
Again, domestic issues. This is a civil war. This is the history of China. And it will probably happen relatively shortly in the future.
And the KMT lost the war, famously, and they retreated to Taiwan, protected by the Americans. And basically, that has been the situation to this day. It's an unfinished civil war. The losers of, well, they haven't completely lost yet because it's an unfinished civil war, but basically those who lost the mainland are still in Taiwan, protected by the Americans.
See, he has a view that Taiwan has no sovereignty itself. They have no government, duly elected representatives, highly functioning society, highly wealthy society compared to the mainland. pretty much outperformed China in every way until very recently. And so he just completely disregards many of Taiwan's calls for independence and sovereignty, that they are an independent country. Again, try to say Taiwan in China, you have to say Chinese Taipei.
And for China, the reason why it's so important is basically for two reasons. A, because they want to put an end to their civil war. It's a bit like, if you compare that with an American context, it's a bit like, if at the end of the Civil War, some group of Confederates had, isolated themselves in, part of Texas, protected by the Russians or the Chinese, and we're still there, right? And so the rest of the American population would be like, okay, at some point, that situation needs to end. Like, they need to.
No, if that happened, after how many years has it been? What was it, 1940 or 19? No, it was it was before World War II, wasn't it? Anyway, 75, 80 years. No, we wouldn't say the Civil War is not complete. We would not say that. We would say, yeah, that's a Republic of Texas, or whatever the case is, and maybe fight another war. But we would not bring them in after this long, saying this is an unfinished civil war. That is Chinese propaganda.
Surrender or something. And also in the Chinese mindsets, in the historical narrative, what was very, very important is the so-called century of humiliation, where foreign powers came to China to colonize part of China. So famously Hong Kong, the British, the French as well. We had part of Shanghai, for instance. And this Taiwan is the last remnant of that, where it is the Americans that have basically carved out part of China, and it's the final humiliation that needs to be ended. So that's why it's critically important in the Chinese mindset, and that's why they will never give up on Taiwan. They will reunify. After reunification can mean many different things. I don't think that, for instance, reunification necessarily means the PRC, meaning the communist government, controlling Taiwan. It can also be, a solution like some form of Commonwealth, where you have an entity called China, and then two governments that remain different. One the PRC government and one the RSC government, but they're under the same China roof. There could be a solution like that, but they won't give up on getting the Americans out, basically on some sort of reunification where it's under one roof.
There's permanent U.S. Marines on Taiwan now, if you guys weren't aware of that. That started about 6 months ago, maybe a year ago. There's permanent U.S. military personnel on Taiwan now.
Roof with the foreigners out. That's basically the concept. And then with other countries in Asia, there are not a lot of tensions except for basically 3 countries, I would say.
9-dash line?
Because China has a lot of neighbors. I think it might even be the country in the world that has the most neighbors. I may be wrong on that. Maybe it's Russia, but maybe I don't remember the exact number, but it's something like 10 or 15.
14 borders.
15 countries with which it shares borders, so it's quite significant. There are significant tensions that remain with India, because the border with India was actually carved by the British at the time of colonization, and so there are a lot of disagreements between both countries.
I think it carved the border with Tibet and not with China at the time. So again, Chinese propaganda, Tibet should be free. And so they're saying that is a border with China.
Countries on what belongs to who. And it all stems from British colonization. And there are disagreements with the Philippines. Famously, right now, there are some conflicts around islands that are part of the Spratly Islands.
Oh, he did mention it, but he is mentioning it just in passing. This is a pretty hot situation.
Spratly Islands, and also still a lot of historical tensions with Japan, because I guess the resentment in China from what Japan has done in the Second World War and the invasion of China has never died down, all the more because Japan never accepted that it committed a lot of war crimes, and it's still denying a lot of the history. So that's basically the state of play now.
See, my position on that is a lot of tensions will die down naturally with the passage of time if they weren't being stoked by government propaganda. So, 3 generations, 4 generations, that's about the time I would say that it would be almost completely, those bad sentiments would be dying down or dying out. But they won't be because they are being stoked. And yes, that is the Japanese islands that they are claiming. They're claiming all the 9-dash lines. So they're Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines are all pretty mad about that. And so, yeah, it is not at all like not an expansionist country right now, not going and invade, worrying about other people's business. No, they're pushing their own interests just like everybody else.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I'm not very familiar with this history, and I don't claim to have any kind of special insight, and I'm in no position to ask you very critical questions about this. But I think just simply
Safe doesn't know about the 9-dash line? That's surprising.
listening to your perspective, I think is something that probably my listeners would find valuable and mind-opening compared to the usual stuff that we usually get about this Chinese regime that is out there trying to take over the world. But it is, as you said, quite telling that that there are no, as far as I can tell, there aren't any kind of Chinese as you said, heavy involvement or military alliances with foreign countries, which is quite a remarkable thing to do. And I think Americans take it for granted that they need to be the policemen of the world. And I think one of the dumbest ideas is that they think of this as if it's a favor that they're doing humanity. If we weren't out there.
Well, again, one reason why there's not a lot of military alliances, which they do, I think, have one now with Russia, but because they've been a historically very, very weak nation. Okay. The century of humiliation, they were extremely weak. No one would need to have a military alliance with them. They were extremely poor for a long time. So there's no military alliance capability there. It's only in the last 25 years that there's been a capability to do this. And what do we see? We see them pushing out, being aggressive in the South China Sea, being aggressive on the border of India. I've read stories about Afghanistan. Like Chinese businessmen will come in, they will have a meeting in some sort of restaurant or hotel or whatever. They won't get the deal that they want, and that hotel blows up. Just naturally, the next day blows up. And so, there's all sorts of aggressive negotiations, aggressive handling of situations. Not any outright invasions or anything like that yet. But that might be coming shortly. And again, it's only been in the last 25 years that they've had this capability.
Giving Israel all these weapons, then things would be bad. How would they be able to kill all of these Palestinians if we weren't giving them all these billions of dollars worth of weapons every day? So I think this notion that you can be a big country and not decide that it is your choice what government exists everywhere from Ecuador to Kenya to the Philippines is quite revolutionary.
Of course, China says you have to speak the way we want you to. You have to use the words we want you to. Of course, they do that kind of power. And if you try to get in their way, like in the South China Sea, they are very aggressive.
You can just live with whatever the Ecuadorians or the Kenyans choose for themselves without having to make a decision about it and pass moral judgment on it. And the moral superiority of sitting there and just being able to decide what the people of Ecuador or whatever country need to be doing. I find this has been amazingly normalized in the case of the U.S. and the fact that China doesn't do that, as you said, they just.
It's amazing that he can criticize the U.S. so with such a broad brush and not criticize the proper parties. It's the Marxists, the globalist Marxists that are doing this. The Davos types that have penetrated the cabinets, as Klaus Schwab would say. So it is a certain type of people in the United States that are doing this, and it's not the United States as a whole. Okay, but in China, they are an authoritarian state, a one-party system, a CCP. So you're conflating kind of a temporary ruling party driven by elections in the West, which, yes, I agree, is Marxist and dangerous, and we need to get rid of them. But in the CCP, you can't. They're all Marxists. They're all Leninists. It's one big party system that doesn't have free elections. So like it's amazing. It's just amazing to me that this free market economist is saying these things.
Give us hospitals rather than lectures is quite revolutionary. All right.
Yeah,
so
I think just on that, I think this has very deep roots. So I think the US is very missionary because I think of its Christian roots, where the goal was always to spread the ideas, spread the religion. Right now, it's not Christianism anymore, but it's more liberal democracy and so on. But there was always this proselytism at heart in the Western mindset, where we need to convert others to our ideas because they are the best, and unless they are converted, they don't know the truth. They live in inferiority, and that's bad for them. That's kind of the thinking. China never had this thinking in its entire history.
I don't know what he's talking about there. Maybe the Spanish, something like that. America hasn't been a proselytizing nation like that. We were non-interventionist, isolationist for the first almost 200 years that we were around. We cared about ourselves, what we were doing. And I mean, even, was it George Washington and his parting comments from the first presidency saying, don't get entangled with foreign alliances. We are a very insular people by nature. And so he doesn't really know anything what he's saying there. He's just trying to draw this dichotomy between a expeditionary United States, which is very, very new, versus an insular China, which China is insular. But he'll just finish his point.
He never sent Taoist monks, to Europe to convert others to Taoism. On the contrary, the Chinese mindset is actually the exact inverse, where its natural instinct is to always build walls around itself. I mean, the Great Wall of China, for instance, but even during COVID, you saw that the Great Sanitary Wall. For the internet, you're seeing that the Great Firewall of China always builds wall around itself to avoid getting influence from abroad. But
yes, because they're very, very racist. They're actually a very racist country. And the rest of us are barbarians, and they are the Middle Kingdom with the mandate of heaven. They are thinking they're better than everybody else.
Never seeks to influence others. And in fact, if you speak...
I mean, you can even see this in Xi Jinping thought, which I do recommend you guys going over here and reading this post from Bitcoin and Markets. Xi Jinping thinks the rightful place of China is at the top. That's their rightful place. They are, again, the Middle Kingdom, and they deserve the best. They deserve more than others.
To any Chinese, on you tell them, the very idea of trying to convert a foreigner to being Chinese, like, you will get laughed at. Like, that's not even...
Right, because Han Chinese are notoriously racist. So there's no way they would want to convert a barbarian to being Chinese. That's not in their mindset.
That's not possible in their mind. Like, no foreigner can become Chinese or convert to a socialism with Chinese characteristic or this type of thing. It's just not even comprehensible as a concept. So it's this whole notion that if China becomes the most powerful country, it will then try to spread its system around stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of Chinese culture, because it's contrary to everything they're about.
And it's, I think, an excellent example of psychological projection, because people
Yeah,
just assume they
exactly.
clearly they're going to want us to speak Chinese and salute Mao everywhere in the world. They're clearly
Yeah.
going to want Africans.
Well, this is my point. I don't think that China is going to be imperialist. I think they're going to fall apart. You don't see a lot of Americans wanting to move to China, but you see a lot of Chinese wanting to move to America. You see Saifedean wanting to sell his books in America, right? The Chinese want to sell to America. They need to sell to America. So I don't see that there's any threat of imperialism from China. I just want the record straight that they're failing because they're communist Marxists, and to put in, it's fascinating because people will think, especially in Bitcoin, people will think that once you get rid of the United States, once you get rid of the dollar and we're on a Bitcoin standard, then the evil empire of the United States won't be there. The evil empires of the West won't be there to hold people down and exploit them. And there's going to be a huge utopian boom in all of these developing countries and yada, yada, yada. It's the evil Americans that are holding everybody down, which is absolutely the opposite. It is absolutely the opposite of that. When we go to a Bitcoin world, which I think we are going to go to Bitcoin standard, as Saifedean's book famously is titled, we are going to go to a Bitcoin standard, but that's going to coincide with a drastic decline in economic activity. And most people don't understand that because they think of inflation as bad. And I do too, but depending, like inflation is good for the debtor, right? Might be bad for the borrower, or sorry, for the lender. But anyway, so it's good for the borrower, bad for the lender. It's also a natural thing, right? Inflation does spur economic growth. And if you think that there's been so much inflation, inflation does spur economic growth. And so if you take that out, which you can't take out credit completely, but you take that out, you're going to have a lot less economic activity. Interest rates are going to be a lot higher, et cetera, et cetera. These countries that have grown because of foreign direct investment. There's only one country that's ever industrialized without foreign direct investment, and that's Britain, the UK, since they were the first. But every other country that's ever industrialized has done so with foreign direct investment. Now, what happens if you take foreign direct investment away from these countries because credit is so scarce? They start reverting. They revert to their old ways. They revert to their state of nature, if you will, if they're by themselves. And there's very few countries that have holistic economies, very few places have all of the natural resources needed for a modern economy. And so what happens? If international trade breaks down, international credit breaks down, these countries are not going to be able to function in a modern way. They're going to revert. So that's what the end of this dollar system has to offer. And I forgot why I got on that. Let me rewind a couple seconds. We're getting close to the end because I don't want to go over the Uyghur stuff.
And it's, I think, an excellent example of psychological projection, because people just assume they clearly they're going to want us to speak Chinese and salute Mao everywhere.
Oh, so no, my point is that, no, I'm not worried about the Imperial Chinese. I'm worried about the end of the U.S. hegemony. And so, not that I want U.S. imperialism, but I see the coming era is much less prosperous than the current, like the era that we're leaving right now, which is the last 50 years or so, 50 to 75 years post World War II, we could just say. That era was extremely prosperous. And despite the problems that the U.S. has brought to the world, the war crimes and the wars and all this stuff, the world is extremely more prosperous now. Modern economies are everywhere. Developed nations are way better than they were 100 years ago. Okay, developing nations. Sorry, the third world countries. I'm concerned about people having the wrong idea of what the future is going to be, and placing, intellectual honesty as well, having intellectual honesty to see what's going on, and to instead of calling out the Chinese Communist Party and the Marxist Leninists that are in charge there, they're going to diss on a country that has brought so much growth and development to the world, being the United States. It's just misplaced, and it's intellectual dishonesty. So anyway, that's what I would say most people are concerned about.
In the world, they're clearly going to want Africans to treat Mao like they are, like he is the leader of their continent or country, and I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. I think it's the other way around. I think it's quite startling, and when you see it in this perspective, it's just assumed to be a naturally good thing that Americans need to go to all of these backwards countries and teach them about how to actually have civilization, which is, you need to live like an American society where all of the values of...
No, I mean, they can go revert back. This is the same discussion I had with, who was it? What's his name? Gladstein? Alex Gladstein? Like, he was talking about debt slavery from the IMF, and I was like, well, they can just not pay the debt back. Why do they need to pay the debt back? Why don't they just go back to their old ways? Why do they need the outside world? Why do they need all this stuff? Well, exactly because they need the outside world. If they went back to their state of nature, like the normal state of that economy, it's not a complete economy. They might not have wood resources in certain countries. They might not have oil resources in certain countries. They might not have food resources in certain countries, transportation, schooling, human capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't have what's needed for a complete economy. There's one economy in the world that really has that, and that's the United States. China has it to a degree, but they don't have enough. They can't feed their own people. They have to import like half of their energy. So like they don't have a full economy the way the United States does. Russia might, you could say that. But yeah, so that's what I would say about all of this.
America is considered very good, and I think as an economist, my view of this is that obviously there are a lot of great values about America and Western democracies and Western liberal institutions. I think Western liberalism is a great thing. I think classical liberalism of the 19th century is was a great step forward for humanity. But I think that's very, very different from what is happening in the West today, what I like to call fiat democracies, wherein the entire thing runs on printed money. And that's something that I'm very interested in. My second book is all about the fiat standard and the fiat monetary systems. And I think these kind of nice sounding ideals about democracy and freedom and liberality and liberalism, all of that stuff, I believe, is massively undermined by the ability of a central bank to essentially dictate everything that goes on in the country by determining who gets the printed money and who doesn't. And
he should add in there communist government. All of these great ideas are undermined by a communist government, by Marxists. Okay, so he can say this good stuff about the U.S., which in the West, which I'm glad that he did, and then point out the fiat nature of the world today, the West today, which of course you guys know, I don't think we have fiat money. We have credit money. It's different, but he disses on central banks, but not on the communists. I mean, you can't have it both ways here. I mean, which is more entrenched and which has a glimmer of saving it? Can you save the communists, or can you save a beautiful Western civilization with these Western ideals and with just some Marxists that got in charge? Okay, the regime that, again, you can vote out. Which is more likely to be saved? It's not the authoritarian communists there in China. It's the West.
We're left with a with a parody of these enlightenment ideals of this classical liberalism, where these things are just repeated like slogans, whereas in reality, I think a much closer understanding of the reality of freedom in the West can be seen with the actions of the government.
Exactly. Looking at democracy is fascinating to me. There is a survey every year that's made by I think the organization is called the Alliance for Democracy, which was created by a former NATO Secretary General. So you can't accuse them of being biased in favor of China. And so they do that survey every year where they ask every people from every country around the world what they think about democracy. And stunningly, the one country that's where people feel the most that they are in a democracy year after year, and that's been the case for 5 or 6 years already, is China. Completely.
Oh, but they're not. For one, democracy is a bad thing, right? It's two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. So you don't want to have a democracy. We aren't a democracy in any of these Western countries. I think there are some like aspects of true democracy in some places where you can have like referendums and stuff. But overall, the governments are not true democracies. But Chinese people saying they live in a democracy is hilarious. They have been programmed to say that, or they're under threat if they don't say that. It's just they don't vote. They don't vote. That he can use this study with a straight face is amazing to me.
Counterintuitively, and
not just counterintuitively, counter-empirically.
When you dig a bit into the details behind why they answer that in China, is for two main factors. Because the government does what we want, meaning policies are based on people's general feelings on what they want to see the government do. That's one thing. And second thing is justice. They feel that justice is fair, that there is no justice for separate justice for the rich and powerful versus the common people, which is true in China. China puts more billionaires in jail than any other country around the world. It famously goes after corrupt officials and so on and so forth. So it's done a lot. Actually, even justice may be harsher on you if you're rich and powerful than if you're poor and destitute.
It's not justice, though. If you have a country where the rich are, it's understandable, okay, that rich folk, there is kind of a two-tier justice system, and it sucks. But when you have protection under the law and due process, it makes sense that rich people can fight better in court. It just makes sense. And it sucks that there is that inequality, but there is at least a due process. In China, no. The reason why they have a lot of the elites getting arrested and having problems and getting quote unquote justice applied is because they don't have this due process. They don't have the same rights. So he's just sweeping that under the rug. I'm about done with this, guys. I've been going here for an hour and 24 minutes. I think you know my positions. This guy is an apologist for the CCP. Saifedean needs to take a break from podcasting, in my opinion. We owe him a lot over the years, but he is thinking from an emotional lens now instead of a rational lens. But let's do a couple more minutes. Let's see what these other sections. Okay. The next section I'm going to stop because that's when they start getting into the Uyghur stuff, and I don't really want to cover that.
So it's interesting that it's not based on votes because Chinese don't vote for their central government, but it's based on this. And,
they don't vote.
In France, for instance, my country,
less
than 50% of the people think that we live in a democracy, even though we have a voting system. But what many specialists of democracy in France say is that, a bit like what you were saying around fiat democracy, we've become a procedural democracy, so we follow the procedure, but we've lost the spirit. And I think it has to do with spirit versus procedure is quite important. If you follow the procedure but lose the spirit, meaning as a government, you don't act according to the people's will, then it's not exactly democracy anymore. If you're not listening to people's concerns, act according to what they want and so on, the spirit is lost. On that subject, there was...
Let me just say something about that. So procedure versus spirit. You want procedure because that's due process. You want to be ruled by law and not by man. And so the fact that he can't see that, the Chinese in his representation, they are playing hot and fast. Okay. And then what happens when you play hot and fast? You're going to get overthrown. You're going to break apart. You're going to have internal problems. And that's what we see. So China, the spirit that he even said they don't vote, yet they believe that they live in quote unquote democracy, which I think they're using as a euphemism for like representative government in general, because, democracy, we don't have a democracy. It's a bad thing. But no, you want procedure. You want it to not work that great. You want it to be gridlock. Gridlock is good. Why? Because it protects your rights. It makes it so one group can't take total power. One party, one communist party cannot take total power. That's why you want procedure, and you want messiness. Messiness is good, even though it feels bad and there are victims. Okay, there's innocent people that are victims, and there's deaths, there's false imprisonments, and all of that stuff sucks. But it's better than the alternative. The alternative is no due process. The alternative is no rights. Rule by the whim of your Leninist leader. Okay, that's the alternative. So it's just crazy that he can compare these things and talk about a lack of procedure, and instead being ruled by animal spirits as a better form to protect your rights and get quote unquote justice. Okay, that's not the better way to get justice. It's better to apply justice 99% of the time than 0% of the time. And that's what procedure versus spirit does. Okay, so this guy, again, is just a Chinese apologist. And I'm going to end it there, guys. Go to bitcoinandmarkets.com. Check out my piece on Xi Jinping thought. Sign up for a free email list. You can also become a member, $5 a month, professional tier there. And if you want to sponsor my content even more, you can do so with the premium patron over there. But I appreciate you guys for tuning in on this long jabbering discussion of Saifedean and Arnaud Bertrand, their love affair over China and the communists, the Marxist-Leninists versus a West that is having problems right now, but actually has constitutions, actually has rights, actually has due process and private property. It's not perfect, but it is a much better system. Also, I'll just close with this on China. China's collapsing. I don't think it makes it 50 years from here. They already are right at the time frame, roughly, that the Soviet Union lasted. So they probably don't have much longer. Their people are suffering. The real estate is crashing. Foreign direct investment is crashing. Their markets are crashing. People are trying to flee with capital and their own bodies, their own persons, to the United States or to the West or to the UAE or whatever. They're trying to get out. And you don't see that same sort of thing from the West, even though it's so bad here. So, yeah, we are in a fourth turning, but these things will pass. We'll get rid of the cultural Marxist Davos types that are in power in the West, and we will get our freedoms back, and hopefully we will benefit from that. So, okay, guys, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you all. Well, let me check comments. I forgot to do that. Sorry. Dex Invictus back with us. What's up, buddy? Raphael. Okay, yeah, I think you were the one that was asking for me to do this. So you said great that I dissected this. Safe had the latest podcast on the Israel-Gaza situation with Constantine. Okay, was that on Safe's podcast? I think that's what it was. Yeah, and he went off. I saw a little clip of that on Twitter. He just needs to take a break. He's thinking emotionally and not rationally. I mean, it's two of his hero economists are Jewish. I don't know. He just needs to take a break. Safe summarizes his basic viewpoint at the end because there were many interruptions in the podcast, but the whole episode was interesting. I'll have to check it out. Perhaps you can also dissect this given your military logistics and economics background. Very interesting developments in the world, and Bitcoin is in the middle of all this good stuff. Yeah, so I do have a degree in economics, and I did 10-year career in the military with battle planning, air battle planning, and logistics of that sort, like how to prosecute a air war, also with intelligence gathering and interpretation and stuff like that. So I've done some of that in my former life. I would say, if you want me to dissect China militarily, they're extremely untested and they have zero doctrine or near zero doctrine. So one of the things that they were talking about on this episode about how it's so great that China is not interventionist militarily around the world and stuff. Well, that's where you build your doctrine. Okay. And doctrine is just like rules of engagement, one, but also experience for your troops. This institutional knowledge, okay, passed down from drill sergeant to soldier, and also the logistics of how to prosecute big time naval conflicts or big arrow movements on the map of troop movements and stuff. Like those types of things are all about doctrine. They're all about logistics, and China has none of that. Zero. They have never won a naval engagement in the history of China, going back thousands of years. They could claim that they might have won some on rivers because they did fight some like naval skirmishes with boats on rivers and stuff in ancient history. But especially in modern history, they have never won a naval battle at all. They do have a lot of boats, but a lot of them are like civilian converted boats. Their aircraft carriers that they have are subpar, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't think that we could invade them. That would be silly. But I don't think they can forcibly take Taiwan. And I don't think they can forcibly really take anyone else either. I mean, maybe some of those Central Asian countries, but that would be pretty tough. If the U.S. can't do it with our doctrine and our logistics, it would be pretty bad for the Chinese. Also, when they have gotten in conflicts, I think it was 1969, they got in conflict with Russia up there in the northeast of China, and they were schooled. They also have gotten in conflicts recently on the border with India, and they have some agreement where they don't carry firearms there, I guess. And so they're fighting with sticks and fists and bats and stuff, and they got their butts kicked there as well. Yeah, so that's what I would say about overall on their military logistics and their economics background. So they tried to open up with Deng Xiaoping, or they did open up, and they started moving away from Mao. So Mao was obviously disaster with the Cultural Revolution and all that. They started moving away from his hardcore Marxist policies and opening up more to the West. But it was kind of a plot all along. So communism is a process, if you guys are familiar with it. That, Marx at the end of history is communism, because you go through these different phases of economic systems, capitalism is the second to last, and that's where you build your capital. Capitalism builds the capital, and then the communists come in and they revolt, the workers revolt against their overlords and seize the capital and the means of production. And that's what a communist revolution was. Well, the Chinese kind of figured around, I would say, in the 80s, this started happening. They started figuring out like they seized the means of production, but they didn't really have any means of production. They didn't have any capital to seize. The communist revolution was early in China, and so they needed to build the capital up before they seized it. Well, then they opened up. Then Deng Xiaoping opened up. They had a bunch of foreign direct investment. They got a lot of outsourcing from all over the world. They built certain industries. However, they never could do like their own stuff very well. Like there wasn't really any inventions out of China. There wasn't any high-end manufacturing where you need a lot of precision. That has never happened in China. And just a couple years back, they started being able to produce ballpoint pens. Now let me look that up. China ballpoint pen. Okay. So yeah, 2017 is when they started being able to they made their first ballpoint pen, because that ballpoint on the pen, the little ball bearing that rolls, was so precise that they didn't have the precision ability to do that. So that, yeah, they were this manufacturing powerhouse, but they couldn't do precision. They can't do innovation, really. Other people invent stuff, they backwards engineer it, and then they become the biggest builders of it, the biggest manufacturers of it, of basic things, but not of the very highest quality stuff that takes the highest amount of engineering. So that's kind of the background on that. Let me just see if I can find this. So this is from the Washington Post, and it says, finally. Oh man, they're making me. Let me see if this is archived. Let me see if this has archive on it. All right. Finally, China manufactures a ballpoint pen all by itself. Oh, how patronizing. President Xi Jinping made headlines this week with a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos that passionately defended free trade in the face of a worldwide surge in anti-globalism populism. So this has been going on a long time, since 2017 at minimum, and this is still going on, and they do not want this. So China does not want anti-globalism populism. This is against their economic model. That's why I say their economic model is dead, because not only are they cracking down, they're also moving into a world where there's just not that stuff, not the same situation as what built China in the first place. But closer to home, a less dramatic story may paint a more complicated and nuanced picture of China's role in the global economy. This story involves something as simple as the ballpoint pen. Yes, that humble device you may well have lying around your desk or collecting dust at the bottom of your bag. The Chinese' long, frustrating quest to manufacture it domestically. This question. This month, that quest has finally been fulfilled, and the Chinese state media is all over it. Here's just one example of the coverage, okay? China has developed its own ballpoint pen tips, ending the long-term reliance on imported ones. To anyone outside of the ballpoint pen manufacturing world, this might seem hard to understand. What exactly is so surprising about this development? China already produces 38 billion ballpoint pens per year. So they produce 38 billion ballpoint pens, but they couldn't produce the ballpoint. 80% of all ballpoint pens in the world. That's a lot of pens, but there's a catch. China had long been unable to produce a high-quality version of the most important part of the pen, its tip. The tip of the ballpoint pen is what makes it a ballpoint pen. At the tip, a freely rotating ball is held in a small socket which connects it to an ink reservoir that allows the pen to write or draw lines. Manufacturing a ballpoint pen tip that can write comfortably for a long period of time requires high precision machinery and precisely thin steel. But for years, China was unable to match those crafted by foreign companies. While there were over 3,000 companies manufacturing pens in China, none had their own high-end technology for the tip. Instead, about 90% of the pens, tips, and refills, too, were imported from Japan, Germany, and Switzerland, according to Chinese state media. This cost the industry $17.3 million per year. China's inability to produce a complete high-quality ballpoint pen came to widespread attention in 2015 when Premier Li Keqiang, I should know how to pronounce that, singled out the products as at a seminar in Beijing, noting that his writing was rough when he used Chinese-made ballpoint pens. For Li, China's failure to manufacture a complete ballpoint pen was indicative of the Chinese economy's weakness. That's the real situation facing us, he said. We cannot make ballpoint pens without a smooth writing function. The Chinese premier's comments caused a consternation in China's pen industry, which was understandably not used to being a topic of mainstream political conversation. These pen companies were once happy to manufacture shoddy pens that were sometimes exported abroad as cheap knockoffs of better brands. Now they're being told that they were expected to do something more. In the past, the government praised the big companies, blah, blah, blah. So you can see this is not made up. This is a real thing. 2017 is when they started being able to make ballpoint pens, which is kind of funny. All right, more comments. Probably WorldCoin proponent. Tomek, you're saying Arnaud Bertrand is? Maybe. I don't think he's up on this stuff at all. I wonder when he lived in China last, because he didn't seem to be up on a lot of things. They didn't even touch on like CBDCs. I think Saif might have mentioned it, but he didn't comment on it, so I don't think he really knows much about anything. Tomek, I'm surprised that 1 billion people can't organize against tyranny. That's because they're very poor. The average Chinese person is very poor still. They're a low-income country. Even though they have like very high total GDP, per capita GDP is very low in China. And that's one of the problems too with the demographics is they got old before they got rich, and now they can't get rich because they're getting too old. So, and old people really don't protest. They don't rise up as much. So that might put a damper on some of my claims that they're going to have a revolution, but they still have a sizable amount of young population. Right now, they have a lot of men that they have like 100 million excess men compared to women. So I did write about that in my demographic post, that since they have such an imbalance of men versus women due to the one-child policy, that their replacement rate is not 2.1 like everyone else's. Their replacement rate is probably like 2.2 or 2.3. I don't know. You'd have to work the math out on that because there's 100 million more men. So that means women have to replace the population. The women have to have more children because there's fewer women. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, next, Tomek. I always find your videos enjoyable. Thanks, man. Thanks. Yeah, late in the evening. I'm going to try to experiment with some different times, different lengths. I thought short version would be better, but this one, obviously, look how long this is. I want to get some topics that I like make a script for, and I just read it out. But I do like the live stuff. That way I don't have to worry about editing a video because I'm perfectionist, and so I worry about editing the audio, the video, all that stuff. I don't want to worry about that. I just want to go live and have a script that I write out and just do that out. I'll try to do some short ones. This is obviously a longer one. Tomek, you say you were born in Poland. Interesting. I am actually Polish. I didn't even know this. So I wonder where you're from. Put that in the chat if you're still listening. Oh, you like the long version. Okay. Yeah, my grandparents came from Gliwice, Poland. It's Poland now, but it was Germany back, pre-World War II. And so my grandmother's maiden name was Shibaletsky or something like that. And so she was Polish, but she thought she was German, or at least they claimed to be German. And I think my grandpa was half German or something as well. So my dad there, he was born in Germany after the war, and he had pretty much 100% Polish blood. They thought they were German. No, they didn't know that until later in life. My dad got the test, the DNA test, and he came back as Polish. And okay, you say you're from the South. I'm not familiar with that place, but is it southwest or southeast, or like maybe south central, right on the border or something? Okay, you used to be under Germany. Okay, so this is pretty much the same way. There's a small town called Gleiwitz around there somewhere. Anyway, so, and then my mom, she thought she was Czech and stuff, but turns out that my Czech grandma was actually German. And so I get my German part from my mom, which we never knew, and I get my Polish part from my dad, which never knew. Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining. We've been going now for 1 hour and 46 minutes. Let me check Telegram and see if there's any comments over there. Oh, 10 comments. What's up, guys? How many people are watching over there? No, you guys all dipped out of here. Social credit system is probably a dystopian as it gets. This should be a line in the sand for everyone. I agree with that, Jerpin. The line in the sand was wearing a mask. Or when cities burned to the ground. No red wave. Yeah. None of the Arab countries want the Palestinians. Yep. That's why I said that about Egypt, because nobody wants them. And yeah, so that should tell you something. I don't want to get involved with it, but it's not my issue. It's not America's issue. We shouldn't be getting involved. But the world is what it is. And you can look at it emotionally, which is understandable, especially if you are Palestinian, or if you do live in Lebanon and stuff like that. But it clouds your judgment, man. You cannot make rational judgments about the situation. About, like, look, he can't. Not only can he not make rational conclusions about what's going on over there, but he can't make rational conclusions about what's going on in the United States either, because it clouds his judgment completely. Or in China. He just sees that China is against the United States, or kind of rival, and he thinks the U.S. is so evil, and so China must be better because it's a rival, or something like this. This is the clouded emotional reasoning that you get instead of actual, real hard, rational thought. So he needs to take a break. Okay. Oh, Tony, you say, okay, we're doomed then. Okay, Evil Spock, our Brazilian compatriot here. Great vid. Only add that differently than the IMF, Chinese deal with guarantees. They trade big buildings for years of oil or other raw materials. Yeah, that's a good point. They're getting something. Okay, they're not doing it out of the kindness of their communist hearts. All right, they're doing this for a reason. It's centrally planned, so it's going to be a nefarious communist reason. Absolutely, 100%. But yeah, that's a good point about quid pro quo, right? They give you this loan at a low interest rate that you don't deserve, and you'll never be able to pay back, but then you guarantee 10 years of raw materials or raw resources, whatever. Yeah. Chinese have bases in Africa. They aren't that internal. They have one base in Africa that I know of, and that is let's go Google Maps, check it out. So let me zoom far out, and we'll make our way. I'll switch it over here in just a second. All right, so we're here, the Horn of Africa. Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, and they have a military base here in Djibouti. I'm not exactly sure where it is. I think it might be actually right here. Let's see if we can find it. I don't know if it'll be labeled or anything, but I think it's right here across the Bab al-Mandab Strait, where all the Houthis are causing their problems. So the Chinese base is like right here, and they're doing nothing, which is interesting because they've made $40 billion of investments in the Red Sea. So a lot of people were talking, about this, the Houthis and all of their disruption of shipping. And I was asking, like, who benefits here? Who benefits the most? Well, China is making a lot of investments around Suez and on the east coast of Egypt and stuff. Of course, then Saudi Arabia as well. They have all this plans with the line. I think that's supposed to be up here in this region at the north. Let me make sure that's coming through. Yeah. So, how do I get rid of that shit? I'm not a Google Maps expert guy. So, yeah, this is supposed to be, let me close that down. This is supposed to be where the line is. So there's a lot of investment going on in the North Red Sea. And who benefits from cutting this off? Well, Egypt is screwed. I've seen recently the revenue from the Suez Canal is down. They were making like, I don't know, $160 million a year or something like that off of Suez. And it's almost down to zero. It's like 20 million. And so all of this investment that China was doing up here and the Saudis were doing up here, that's been cut off by the Houthis. So who's going to be mad at Iran and funding of the Houthis and funding of Hamas? Well, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. This place is not, it's not easy. It's not clear cut. There's different sides. There's like 5 different sides here that we're trying to deal with. And so you have to look at it rationally. You can't just jump to an emotional conclusion on things. Okay, what else do we got? Telegram. I was in Telegram. All right, that was it. That was the last one from Evil Spock. Okay, well, that's where I'm going to end it today, guys. Then thanks for joining me. This was kind of a different show. Reaction to Saifedean and Arnaud Bertrand. Check out bitcoinandmarkets.com, and I'll see you guys on